Section 15 of After Dark. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lilith Brander. After Dark by Wilkie Collins. The French Governess Story of Sister Rose, Part 2, Chapter 2. Ignorant of the change in her husband's plans, which was to bring him back to Paris a day before the time that had been fixed for his return, Sister Rose had left her solitary home to spend the evening with her brother. They had sat talking together long after sunset, and had let the darkness steal on them insensibly, as people will who are only occupied with quiet, familiar conversation. Thus it happened, by curious coincidence, that just as Lomaque was blowing out his candles at the office, Rose was lighting the reading lamp at her brother's lodgings. 5 years of disappointment and sorrow had subtly changed her to outward view. Her face looked thinner and longer. The once delicate red and white of her complexion was gone. Her figure had wasted under the influence of some weakness, which had already made her stoop a little when she walked. Her manner had lost its maiden shyness, only to become unnaturally quiet and subdued. Of all the charms which had so fatally, yet so innocently, allured her heartless husband, but one remained, the winning gentleness of her voice. It might be touched now and then with a note of sadness, but the soft attraction of its even, natural tone still remained. In the marring of all other harmonies, this one harmony had been preserved unchanged. Her brother, though his face was careworn and his manner sadder than of old, looked less altered from his former self. It is the most fragile material which soonest shows the flaw. The world's idol, beauty, holds its frailest tenure of existence in the one temple where we most love to worship it. And so you think, Louis, that our perilous undertaking has really ended well by this time? Said Rose, anxiously, as she lighted the lamp and placed the glass shade over it. What a relief it is only to hear you say you think we have succeeded at last. I said I hope, Rose, replied her brother. Well, even hoped is a great word from you, Louis, a great word from anyone in this fearful city, and in these days of terror. She stopped suddenly, seeing her brother raise his hand in warning. They looked at each other in silence and listened. The sound of footsteps going slowly past the house, ceasing for a moment just beyond it, then going on again, came through the open window. There was nothing else, out of doors or in, to disturb the silence of the night, the deadly silence of terror which, for months past, had hung over Paris. It was a significant sign of the times that even a passing footstep, sounding a little strangely at night, was subject for suspicion, both the brother and sister, so common a subject that they suspended their conversation as a matter of course, without exchanging a word of explanation, until the tramp of the strange footsteps had died away. Louise, continued Rose, dropping her voice to a whisper, after nothing more was audible. When may I trust our secret to my husband? Not yet, rejoined Trudaine, earnestly. Not a word, not a hint of it, till I give you leave. Remember, Rose, you promised silence from the first. Everything depends on your holding that promise sacred till I release you from it. I will hold it sacred. I will indeed, at all hazards, under all provocations, she answered. That is quite enough to reassure me. And now, love, let us change the subject. Even these walls may have ears, and the closed door yonder may be no protection. He looked toward it uneasily while he spoke. By the by, I have come round to your way of thinking, Rose. About that new servant of mine, there is something false in his face. I wish I had been as quick to detect it as you were. Rose glanced at him affrightedly. Has he done anything suspicious? Have you caught him watching you? Tell me the worst, Louis. Hush, hush, my dear, not so loud. Don't alarm yourself. He has done nothing suspicious. Turn him off. Pray, pray turn him off, before it is too late. and be denounced by him in revenge the first night he goes to his section. You forget that servants and masters are equal now. I am not supposed to keep a servant at all. I have a citizen living with me who lays me under domestic obligations, for which I make a pecuniary acknowledgment. No, if I do anything, I must try if I can't entrap him into giving me warning. But we have got to another unpleasant subject already. Suppose I change the topic again? You will find a little book on that table there in the corner. Tell me what you think of it. The book was a copy of Corneille's Cid, prettily bound in blue morocco. Rose was enthusiastic in her praises. I found it in a bookseller's shop yesterday, said her brother, and bought it as a present for you. Corneille is not an author to compromise anyone, even in these times. Don't you remember saying the other day that you felt ashamed of knowing but little of our greatest dramatist? Rose remembered well, and smiled almost as happily as in the old times over her present. There are some good engravings at the beginning of each act, continued Trudaine, directing her attention rather earnestly to the illustrations, and then suddenly leaving her side when he saw that she became interested in looking at them. He went to the window, listened, then drew aside the curtain, and looked up and down the street. No living soul was in sight. I must have been mistaken, he thought, returning hastily to his sister. But I certainly fancied I was followed in my walk today by a spy. I wonder, asked Rose, still busy over her book. I wonder, Louis, whether my husband would let me go with you to see Le Cid the next time it is acted. No, cried a voice at the door. Not if you went on your knees to ask him. Rose turned round with a scream. There stood her husband on the threshold, scowling at her, with his hat on, and his hands thrust doggedly into his pockets. Trudaine's servant announced him, with an insolent smile, during the pause that followed the discovery. Citizen Superintendent Danville, to visit the citoyenne his wife, said the fellow, making a mock bow to his master. Rose looked at her brother, then advanced a few paces toward the door. This is a surprise, she said faintly. Has anything happened? We didn't expect you. Her voice failed her as she saw her husband advancing, pale to his very lips with suppressed anger. How dare you come here, after what I told you? He asked, in quick, low tones. She shrank at his voice almost as if he had struck her. The blood flew into her brother's face as he noticed the action, but he controlled himself, and taking her hand, led her in silence to a chair. I forbid you to sit down in his house, said Danville, advancing still. I order you to come back with me. Do you hear? I order you. He was approaching nearer to her when he thought Trudaine's eyes fixed on him and stopped. Rose started up and placed herself between them. Oh, Charles, she said to her husband, be friends with Louis tonight, and be kind again to me. I have a claim to ask that much of you, though you may not think it. He turned away from her and laughed contemptuously. She tried to speak again, but Trudaine touched her on the arm and gave her a warning look. Signals, exclaimed Danville. Secret signals between you. His eye, as he glanced suspiciously at his wife, fell on Trudaine's gift book, which she still held unconsciously. What book is that? He asked. Only a play of Corneille's, answered Rose. Louis had just made me a present of it. At this avowal, Danville's suppressed anger burst beyond all control. Give it him back, he cried, in a voice of fury. You shall take no presents from him. The venom of the household spy soils everything he touches. Give it him back. She hesitated. You won't? He tore the book from her with an oath, threw it on the floor, and set his foot on it. Oh, Louis, for God's sake, remember. Trudaine was stepping forward as the book fell to the floor. At the same moment his sister threw her arms round him. He stopped, turning from fiery red to ghastly pale. No, Louis, she said, clasping him closer. Not after 5 years' patience, no. He gently detached her arms. You are right, love. Don't be afraid. It is all over now. Saying that, He put her from him, and in silence took up the book from the floor. "Won't that even you even?" said Danville, with an insolent smile. "You have a wonderful temper." "Any other man would have called me out." Trudaine looked back at him steadily, and taking out his handkerchief, passed it over the soiled cover of the book. "If I could wipe the stain of your blood off my conscience as easily as I can wipe the stain of your boot off this book," he said quietly, "you should not live another hour. Don't cry, Rose," he continued, turning again to his sister. "I will take care of your book for you until you can keep it yourself." "You will do this, you will do that," cried Danville, growing more and more exasperated, and letting his anger get the better even of his cunning now. "Talk less confidently of the future. You don't know what it has in store for you. Govern your tongue when you are in my presence. A day may come when you will want my help. My help. Do you hear that?" Trudaine turned his face from his sister, as if he feared to let her see it when those words were spoken. "The man who followed me today was a spy. Danville's spy." That thought flashed across his mind, but he gave it no utterance. There was an instant's pause of silence, and through it there came heavily on the still night air the rumbling of distant wheels. The sound advanced nearer and nearer, advanced and ceased under the window. Danville hurried to it and looked out eagerly. "I have not hastened my return without reason. I wouldn't have missed this arrest for anything," thought he, peering into the night. The stars were out, but there was no moon. He could not recognize either the coach or the persons who got out of it, and he turned again into the interior of the room. His wife had sunk into a chair. Her brother was locking up in the cabinet the book which he had promised to take care of for her. The dead silence made the noise of slowly ascending footsteps on the stairs painfully audible. At last the door opened softly. "Citizen Danville, health and fraternity," said Lomaque, appearing in the doorway, followed by his agents. "Citizen Louis Trudaine," he continued, beginning with the usual form. Rose started out of her chair, but her brother's hand was on her lips before she could speak. "My name is Louis Trudaine," he answered. "Charles," cried his sister, breaking from him and appealing to her husband. "Who are these men? What are they here for?" He gave her no answer. "Louis Trudaine," said Lomaque, slowly drawing the order from his pocket. "In the name of the Republic, I arrest you." "Rose, come back," cried Trudaine. It was too late. She had broken from him, and in the recklessness of terror had seized her husband by the arm. "Save him," she cried. "Save him, by all you hold dearest in the world. You are that man's superior, Charles. Order him from the room." Danville roughly shook her hand off his arm. "Lomaque is doing his duty, yes," he added, with a glance of malicious triumph at Trudaine. "Yes, doing his duty. Look at me as you please. Your look won't move me. I denounced you. I admit it. I glory in it. I have rid myself of an enemy, and the state of a bad citizen. Remember your secret visits to the house in the Rue de Cléry." His wife uttered a cry of horror. She seized his arm again with both hands, frail, trembling hands that seemed suddenly nerved with all the strength of a man's. Come here, I must and will speak to you." She dragged him by main force a few paces back toward an unoccupied corner of the room. With deathly cheeks and wild eyes, she raised herself on tiptoe and put her lips to her husband's ear. At that instant Trudaine called to her. "Rose, if you speak, I'm lost." She stopped at the sound of his voice, dropped her hold on her husband's arm, and faced her brother, shuddering. "Rose," he continued, "you have promised, and your promise is sacred. If you prize your honour, if you love me, come here. Come here and be silent." He held out his hand. She ran to him, and laying her head on his bosom, burst into a passion of tears. Danville turned uneasily toward the police agents. "Remove your prisoner," he said. "You have done your duty here." "Only half of it," retorted Lomaque, eyeing him attentively. "Rose Stanfield." "My wife!" exclaimed the other. "What about my wife?" "Rose Stanfield," continued Lomaque impassively. "You are included in the arrest of Louis Trudaine." Rose raised her head quickly from her brother's breast. His firmness had deserted him. He was trembling. She heard him whispering to himself, "Rose too, oh my God, I was not prepared for that." She heard these words and dashed the tears from her eyes and kissed him, saying, "I am glad of it, Louis. We risked all together. We shall now suffer together. I am glad of it." Danfield looked incredulously at Lomaque after the first shock of astonishment was over. "Impossible!" he exclaimed. "I never denounced my wife. There is some mistake. You have exceeded your orders." "Silence!" retorted Lomaque imperiously. "Silence, citizen, and respect the decree of the Republic." "You blackguard, show me the arrest order," said Danfield. "Who has dared to denounce my wife?" "You have," said Lomaque, turning on him with a grin of contempt. "You, and blackguard back in your teeth. You, in denouncing her brother. Aha! We work hard in our office. We don't waste time in calling names. We make discoveries. If Trudaine is guilty, your wife is implicated in his guilt. We know it, and we arrest her." "I resist the arrest," cried Danfield. "I'm the authority here. Who opposes me?" The impassible chief agent made no answer. Some new noise in the street struck his quick ear. He ran to the window and looked out eagerly. "Who opposes me?" reiterated Danfield. "Hark!" exclaimed Lomaque, raising his hand. "Silence, and listen." The heavy, dull tramp of men marching together became audible as he spoke. Voices humming low and in unison the Marseillaise hymn, joined solemnly with the heavy, regular footfalls. Soon the flared torchlight began to glimmer redder and redder under the dim, starlight sky. "Do you hear that? Do you see the advancing torchlight?" cried Lomaque, pointing exultingly into the street. "Respect to the national hymn, and to the man who holds in the hollow of his hand the destinies of all France. Hats off, citizen Danfield. Robespierre is in the street. His bodyguard, the hard-hitters, are lighting him on his way to the Jacobin Club. Who shall oppose you, do you say? Your master and mine. The man whose signature is at the bottom of this order. The man who, with a scratch of his pen, can send both our hats rolling together into the sack of the guillotine. Shall I call to him as he passes the house? Shall I tell him that Superintendent Danfield resists me in making an arrest? Shall I? Shall I?" And in the immensity of his contempt, Lomaque seemed absolutely to rise in stature, as he thrust the arrest order under Danfield's eyes and pointed to the signature with the head of his stick. Rose looked round in terror as Lomaque spoke his last words, looked round and saw her husband recoil before the signature on the arrest order, as if the guillotine itself had suddenly arisen before him. Her brother felt her shrinking back in his arms and trembled for the preservation of her self-control if the terror and suspense of the arrest lasted any longer. "Courage, Rose, courage," he said. "You have behaved nobly. You must not fail now. No, no, not a word more, not a word till I am able to think clearly again, and to decide what is best. Courage, love. Our lives depend on it. Citizen," he continued, addressing himself to Lomaque, "proceed with your duty. We are ready." The heavy marching footsteps outside were striking louder and louder on the ground. The chanting voices were every moment swelling in volume. The dark street was flaming again with the brightening torchlight as Lomaque, under pretext of giving Trudaine his hat, came close to him, and turning his back towards Danfield, whispered, "I have not forgotten the eve of the wedding and the bench on the river bank." Before Trudaine could answer, he had taken Rose's cloak and hood from one of his assistants, and was helping her on with it. Danfield, still pale and trembling, advanced a step when he saw these preparations for departure, and addressed a word or two to his wife, but he spoke in low tones, and the fast advancing march of feet and sullen low roar of singing outside drowned his voice. An oath burst from his lips, and he struck his fist in impotent fury on the table near him. "The seals are set on everything in this room and in the bedroom," said Magloire, approaching Lomaque, who nodded and signed to him to bring up the other police agents at the door. "Ready!" cried Magloire, coming forward immediately with his men, and raising his voice to make himself heard. "Where to?" Robespierre and his heart-heaters were passing the house. The smoke of the torchlight was rolling in at the window. The tramping footsteps struck heavier and heavier on the ground. The low, sullen roar of the Marseillaise was swelling to its loudest, as Lomaque referred for a moment to his arrest order, and then answered, "To the prison of Saint Lazare." Section 15.